David Carter had dreamed of owning a quiet piece of land ever since he retired from 30 years of working as a civil engineer. When he found a beautiful 10-acre property on the edge of Pine Ridge Estates, it seemed like everything he had worked for. The land stretched across rolling hills with towering oak trees, a small creek running through the western side, and a gravel access road that had existed long before the neighborhood itself was built. The previous owner assured David that the road legally belonged to the property and was included in the deed. During closing, the title company confirmed it again. Everything was documented, surveyed, and recorded with the county. David smiled as he signed the final papers, imagining peaceful mornings drinking coffee on his porch while watching deer cross the field. For the first few weeks, life was exactly as he imagined. He built a modest farmhouse, planted fruit trees, repaired old fences, and even introduced himself to a few neighbors. Most of them were friendly enough, but every conversation somehow drifted toward the homeowners association. People warned him that the HOA liked to control everything. David laughed politely because his property wasn't part of the subdivision. His deed clearly showed he wasn't under HOA authority. He figured whatever drama existed inside Pine Ridge Estates had nothing to do with him. He was wrong. One Saturday morning, while driving home from the hardware store, David noticed something strange. Workers wearing bright orange safety vests were installing decorative stone pillars on both sides of his gravel road. A large sign lay on the ground waiting to be mounted. It read, "Pine Ridge Estates Private Community Entrance." David parked immediately and walked over. "Excuse me," he said. "Who authorized this work?" One of the workers shrugged. "We're just following HOA instructions." David pointed toward the survey marker. "This road belongs to my property." The foreman looked confused before handing him a clipboard. At the top was a work order signed by HOA President Linda Morrison. David thanked the workers and told them to stop until ownership could be clarified. They packed their tools and left without arguing. That afternoon, David drove to the HOA clubhouse. Inside, several board members were preparing for their monthly meeting. Linda barely looked up from her paperwork when David introduced himself. "There's been a mistake," he said calmly. "Your contractors started building on my private road." Linda leaned back in her chair and smiled with complete confidence. "Actually, Mr. Carter, that road has always been considered part of Pine Ridge Estates." David placed a copy of his survey on the table. "Not according to county records." Linda glanced at it for barely 2 seconds before sliding it back across the table. "Our attorney has already reviewed everything years ago. The residents have used that entrance for decades. It's essentially ours." David frowned. "Usage doesn't create ownership." One board member whispered something to Linda, but she ignored him. "Mr. Carter," she continued, "the neighborhood depends on that entrance. You wouldn't expect hundreds of families to change their route just because you bought some land." David remained calm. "I'm not blocking anyone today. I'm simply asking you not to build permanent structures on property you don't own." Linda folded her arms. "We'll continue with the project." David left without raising his voice. On the drive home, he couldn't stop thinking about how casually she dismissed legal documents. The next morning, construction resumed. The decorative entrance was completed in less than 6 hours. Stone pillars, flower beds, security cameras, and an elaborate neighborhood sign now stood entirely on David's land. Nobody had requested permission. Nobody had signed an easement. Nobody had even informed him. Instead, the HOA acted as if ownership meant nothing. David spent the next several days gathering every document connected to his property. He visited the county recorder's office, obtained certified copies of the original plats dating back nearly 40 years, and hired an independent surveyor to verify every boundary marker. The results were crystal clear. The gravel entrance road belonged 100% to David's parcel. Even more surprising, the HOA had never possessed any recorded easement allowing residents to cross it. For decades, they had simply assumed it was theirs because no previous owner challenged them. David met with attorney Rebecca Lawson, a property rights specialist known throughout the county. She reviewed every page carefully before looking up with a smile. This may be one of the clearest ownership cases I've seen. David asked the obvious question. Can I make them remove everything? Rebecca nodded slowly. Legally, yes, but there's another option. David raised an eyebrow. Rebecca pointed toward the survey map. They've been using your land every single day. If they want continued access, they can pay for it. David stared at the map for several silent seconds before a small grin appeared on his face. You mean charge rent? Rebecca smiled back. Exactly. Fair market commercial access fees. After all, they're benefiting from private property. David chuckled quietly. Something tells me Linda isn't going to like that. Rebecca closed the folder. Whether she likes it doesn't matter. The law is very clear. David walked out of her office feeling something he hadn't felt since discovering the entrance sign. Confidence. The HOA believed they could simply take what wasn't theirs because no one had challenged them before. They had no idea the first invoice was already being prepared. David spent the next 3 days making sure every step would be impossible for the HOA to dismiss. Rebecca insisted they move carefully, documenting everything before sending a single demand. Together they photographed the stone entrance from every angle, measured the exact footprint of the pillars, landscaping, cameras, and lighting, and compared those measurements against the certified survey. Every improvement the HOA had installed sat squarely inside David's property line. Rebecca also hired a commercial appraiser who specialized in access easements. His report explained that because the road served as the primary entrance for more than 300 homes, its commercial value was far greater than an ordinary gravel driveway. The report estimated a fair daily access fee based on the benefit the subdivision received from using the road. When David saw the figure, he nearly laughed. It wasn't outrageous, but multiplied over months or years, it would become a very expensive mistake for the HOA. Rebecca prepared a formal notice. The letter informed Pine Ridge Estates that they had constructed permanent improvements on private property without authorization and were continuing to benefit from unauthorized access. The HOA was given 2 choices. They could remove every structure, restore the land to its original condition, and permanently relocate their entrance within 30 days, or they could enter into a temporary licensing agreement that required payment of a daily access fee beginning immediately. Every day the road remained in use without an agreement would generate another invoice. David signed the letter, and Rebecca sent it by certified mail. 3 days later the response arrived. It wasn't from the HOA's attorney. It came directly from Linda Morrison. The letter was only 2 pages long, but every sentence dripped with arrogance. She claimed David was attempting to extort the neighborhood. She insisted the HOA had acquired permanent rights through decades of public use. She dismissed the survey as irrelevant technical paperwork and warned that any attempt to interfere with neighborhood traffic would result in legal action against him. Rebecca read the letter once, smiled, and placed it in a file marked admissions. David looked confused. She just threatened to sue me. Rebecca nodded. Yes, but she also admitted they're intentionally using your property after receiving formal notice. That's actually helpful. The following morning, David watched hundreds of vehicles drive across his road exactly as they had every day before. Parents dropped children at school, contractors entered with trailers, delivery trucks rolled through the decorative entrance, and landscapers hauled equipment into the subdivision. David didn't stop anyone. Instead, he stood quietly near his mailbox with a notebook, recording the steady stream of traffic. At sunset, he printed the very first invoice. It listed 1 day of unauthorized commercial access. The amount wasn't enormous, but it carried a simple statement at the bottom. Additional daily charges will continue until this matter is resolved. Rebecca mailed it that afternoon. The invoices kept coming. Every evening David printed another one. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. By the end of the second week, the HOA had accumulated thousands of dollars in access fees. Linda ignored every invoice. During the monthly HOA board meeting, she stood before dozens of homeowners holding one of David's letters in the air. "This is nothing more than harassment," she declared confidently. "We are not paying a penny." Most residents applauded because they trusted their board. Few of them had ever seen the property records or understood who actually owned the entrance road. But not everyone was convinced. A retired real estate broker named Michael Harris quietly requested copies of the surveys David had referenced. Linda refused, saying the board's attorney had everything under control. Michael found that answer suspicious. The next afternoon, he walked over to David's property carrying nothing more than a notebook and a friendly smile. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" he said. David invited him onto the porch, where they spent nearly 2 hours reviewing surveys, deeds, and county maps. Michael examined every document carefully before shaking his head. "These records are legitimate," he admitted. "If this is accurate, the HOA has a serious problem." David simply replied, "I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just want them to respect property rights." Michael thanked him and left, but word spread quickly. Within days, several homeowners began visiting county offices themselves. They discovered exactly what David already knew. The entrance road had never belonged to the HOA. There had never been an easement. The board had simply assumed ownership because nobody challenged them. As rumors spread through Pine Ridge Estates, tensions exploded. Residents began demanding answers from Linda and the board. Some wanted to know why legal documents hadn't been reviewed before spending HOA funds on the entrance project. Others questioned how many thousands of dollars had already been wasted building decorative structures on someone else's land. Linda tried to reassure everyone that victory in court was guaranteed, but confidence was beginning to disappear. Rebecca, meanwhile, continued documenting everything. Each invoice was mailed on schedule. Interest charges were added exactly as outlined in the notices. David never argued with residents driving through the entrance. He never blocked traffic or threatened anyone. Instead, he maintained the road better than ever, grading the gravel after heavy rain and trimming weeds along the edges. If the dispute ever reached a courtroom, he wanted the judge to see that he had acted reasonably from the very beginning. One afternoon, a local television station noticed the growing controversy after several homeowners contacted reporters anonymously. A news van parked outside David's property. The reporter asked whether he really expected an entire neighborhood to pay daily rent just to use the entrance. David answered, "For months, my neighbors treated my fence like their personal laundry line. Towels, sheets, even underwear flapping in the wind without asking. I stayed polite, dropped hints, even asked nicely. Nothing changed. So I decided enough was enough, and came up with a plan that made sure my fence would never be used as free drying space again." This is the story of quiet revenge, boundaries, and finally standing up to neighbors who took advantage one time too many. If you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors who ignore basic respect for your property, you'll love how this one ends. #NeighborProblems, #EntitledNeighbors, #RevengeStory, #PettyRevenge, #NeighborDrama, #KarmaStory, #PropertyBoundaries, #TrueStoryTime, #Neighbor From Hell, #StandUp For Yourself, #FenceDrama, #HOA Stories, #RedditRevenge, #NeighborKarma, #Justice Served. The first court hearing was scheduled less than a month later, and by then, the controversy had become the biggest topic in the county. Local newspapers called it the road that nobody owned, except one man. Television crews parked outside the courthouse before sunrise, hoping to capture reactions from both sides. David arrived early with Rebecca Lawson, carrying nothing more than a small folder filled with certified property records. Across the hallway, Linda Morrison entered with 3 board members, the HOA's attorney, and several supporters wearing matching Pine Ridge Estates shirts. Linda smiled confidently at every camera, telling reporters the HOA would put an end to this ridiculous money grab. David ignored the attention. He had spent his entire career solving engineering problems, not chasing headlines. Rebecca reminded him that facts mattered more than speeches. When the hearing began, the judge immediately asked both parties to clarify one simple question. Who owns the road? The HOA's attorney argued first. He claimed the subdivision had openly used the entrance for nearly 40 years and that residents depended on it every single day. He argued that removing access would create unnecessary hardship for hundreds of families. Rebecca stood calmly after he finished. She didn't argue about hardship. Instead, She handed the judge certified deeds, county plats, tax records, survey reports, and aerial photographs dating back decades. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The gravel road had always been part of David's property. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the evidence before asking the HOA attorney a direct question. "Can you produce a recorded easement?" The attorney hesitated. "Not at this time, Your Honor." "Can you produce any written agreement allowing permanent use?" Another pause. "No, Your Honor." The silence inside the courtroom became almost uncomfortable. The judge finally looked toward Linda and said, "Using property for many years does not automatically transfer ownership." David didn't celebrate. He simply listened as the judge scheduled a full trial and issued a temporary order stating that the HOA could continue using the road only while the legal dispute was pending. However, the judge also ruled that David had the right to continue invoicing the HOA for reasonable temporary access fees until ownership issues were finally resolved. Linda's confident smile disappeared the moment those words were spoken. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded both sides. Linda insisted they had won an important step, but nobody seemed convinced. David answered only one question before leaving. "The court confirmed what I've been saying since day one. Property rights still matter." Back at Pine Ridge Estates, the pressure on the HOA board increased dramatically. Residents who had trusted Linda without question suddenly wanted explanations. During an emergency HOA meeting, dozens of homeowners filled every chair, with many forced to stand along the walls. Michael Harris stood first. "Did the board ever verify ownership before spending our money?" he asked. Linda avoided eye contact. "We relied on historical use." Michael shook his head. "That's not what I asked." Another resident stood up. "How much have we already spent on those stone pillars and landscaping?" The treasurer quietly admitted the project had cost nearly $180,000, funded entirely through HOA reserves. Gasps filled the room. Then someone asked the question nobody wanted to answer. "How much do we owe David now?" The room fell silent as the treasurer looked down at a spreadsheet. Between daily access fees, accumulated interest, legal expenses, and administrative costs, the total had already climbed into 6 figures. Angry voices erupted from every corner of the clubhouse. Some blamed Linda. Others blamed the attorney who had assured everyone they had legal rights. One homeowner shouted, "Why are we paying lawyers instead of negotiating?" Linda tried to restore order by insisting the final trial would reverse everything, but confidence in her leadership was collapsing. Several board members privately began discussing whether they should resign before things became even worse. David heard about the chaotic meeting from neighbors who stopped by his farm. He never commented publicly. Instead, he focused on maintaining his property, repairing fences, tending his orchard, and documenting every vehicle that crossed the road. Rebecca reminded him that professionalism mattered. "The calmer you remain," she said, "the stronger your position becomes." A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. A developer announced plans to build a new shopping center just outside Pine Ridge Estates. The project promised higher property values, new restaurants, and a grocery store that residents had wanted for years. But there was one major obstacle. The developer's engineers determined that the easiest traffic connection required using the same entrance road crossing David's land. County officials refused to approve construction until access rights were legally resolved. Suddenly, the dispute wasn't affecting only the HOA. It was delaying a multimillion-dollar commercial project. Representatives from the development company contacted David directly. They asked whether he would consider granting a separate commercial access agreement after the lawsuit ended. David politely replied that he would evaluate every proposal based on fairness and respect for property rights. News of that meeting spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some homeowners finally realized just how valuable the road actually was. It wasn't just a driveway. It was the only practical entrance connecting several properties to the main highway. Had the HOA approached David respectfully from the beginning, they could have negotiated a long-term easement for a reasonable amount. Instead, months of arrogance had transformed a simple conversation into a legal disaster. Meanwhile, Rebecca uncovered another damaging fact during discovery. Internal HOA emails revealed that at least one board member had warned Linda before construction even began that ownership records should be verified. Linda responded by writing, "We've used that road forever. Nobody will challenge us." Rebecca smiled when she read the email. It demonstrated that the board had knowingly ignored the risk instead of confirming the facts. At trial, that single sentence could become one of the most important pieces of evidence. As the trial date drew closer, daily invoices continued arriving without interruption. Every sunrise brought another unauthorized day of access. Every sunset added another charge. David wasn't trying to punish anyone. He was simply letting time reveal the true cost of taking something that never belonged to them. By the time both sides prepared to enter the courtroom for the final trial, the amount owed had reached a figure so large that even longtime residents struggled to believe it. The decision that awaited the judge would not only determine ownership, it would decide whether one HOA's costly assumption would become a lesson the entire county would remember for years. The final day of trial attracted more people than anyone expected. Every seat inside the courtroom was filled long before the judge entered. Reporters lined the back wall with notebooks ready, while dozens of Pine Ridge Estates homeowners waited anxiously to learn how much their HOA's decisions would ultimately cost them. David sat quietly beside Rebecca Lawson, reviewing the same folder of documents he had carried since the beginning of the dispute. He wasn't nervous anymore. Months of preparation had replaced uncertainty with confidence. Across the aisle, Linda Morrison looked exhausted. The confidence she displayed during the first hearing had disappeared. The HOA's attorney opened by arguing that forcing the neighborhood to pay such a large amount would unfairly punish innocent homeowners. Rebecca stood and calmly replied, "The issue before this court is not whether the residents deserve sympathy. The issue is whether private property can be taken and used without permission simply because the owner remained silent in the past." She then presented the evidence piece by piece. Certified surveys confirmed ownership. County tax records proved David had paid taxes on the road every single year. Photographs showed the HOA had constructed permanent improvements without written consent. The commercial appraisal justified the daily access fee, and finally, Rebecca introduced the internal HOA email. The courtroom became silent as she read Linda's words aloud. "We've used that road forever. Nobody will challenge us." Rebecca paused before asking the judge one simple question. Does believing someone won't defend their property create ownership? The answer was obvious before the judge even spoke. The HOA attorney attempted to object, but the damage had already been done. The email revealed that the board knowingly ignored the possibility that the road belonged to someone else. Their decision had not been an innocent mistake. It had been a calculated gamble. After several hours of testimony, the judge returned with his written decision. Every person in the courtroom stood as he began reading. He ruled that David Carter was the undisputed legal owner of the entrance road. He found that the HOA had constructed permanent improvements without authorization, continued using the property after receiving formal notice, and ignored multiple opportunities to resolve the matter peacefully. The court ordered Pine Ridge Estates to either negotiate a permanent easement with David within 60 days or remove every unauthorized structure from his land at its own expense. The HOA was also ordered to pay all accumulated daily access fees, interest, court costs, and a significant portion of David's attorney fees. The final judgment exceeded $1 million. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Several homeowners lowered their heads in disbelief. Linda closed her eyes without saying a word. Reporters rushed outside to prepare breaking news alerts. David simply shook Rebecca's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. Rebecca smiled. "You earned this by standing your ground." Outside the courthouse, cameras surrounded David once again. A reporter asked if he planned to celebrate. He smiled politely and answered, "I didn't come here looking for money. I came here because property rights only matter if people are willing to defend them." That short statement became the headline in newspapers across the state. The weeks that followed brought dramatic changes to Pine Ridge Estates. Homeowners demanded the resignation of the entire HOA board, arguing that their arrogance and poor judgment had created a financial disaster that every resident would now share. During a packed special meeting, Linda Morrison officially stepped down as president. Several other board members resigned the same evening. A new board was elected with one clear promise: rebuild trust and settle the dispute responsibly. Their first action was to request a meeting with David. Unlike the previous leadership, they arrived with no threats, no demands, and no assumptions. The new president extended his hand and said, "Mr. Carter, we're here to apologize. We should have spoken with you before building anything." David accepted the handshake. They spent the next several hours discussing practical solutions instead of arguing about the past. Eventually, they reached a long-term easement agreement that allowed residents to continue using the road while ensuring David received fair annual compensation. The HOA also agreed to maintain the entrance at its own expense, respect all future property boundaries, and publicly acknowledge David's ownership. The agreement satisfied everyone involved and finally brought the conflict to an end. Even the shopping center developer benefited, securing legal access through a separate agreement with David that generated additional income while supporting the community's growth. Nearly a year later, life on David's farm had returned to the peaceful routine he imagined when he first purchased the property. The stone entrance still welcomed residents into Pine Ridge Estates, but one important detail had changed. A small bronze plaque stood beside the decorative pillars. It read, "Entrance located on private property. Used under legal agreement." Most drivers passed it without much thought, but longtime residents understood exactly why it was there. It served as a quiet reminder that respect is always less expensive than arrogance. Every morning David watched neighbors drive through the entrance with friendly waves replacing angry stares. Children rode bicycles along the road, delivery trucks came and went, and the community continued to grow. The difference was simple. Everyone now understood that cooperation begins with respect for ownership. Looking back, David realized the dispute had never truly been about money or a gravel road. It had been about a principle. When people believe they can take something simply because it's convenient, they slowly erode the rights that protect everyone. By refusing to surrender those rights, he hadn't just protected his own land. He had reminded an entire community that fairness starts with accountability. And in the end, the most valuable thing he collected wasn't the rent that arrived every month. It was the respect that could never again be taken without permission.